Private security, especially in really unstable parts of the world, it's a high-stakes game. When the rule of law is shaky, how do you make sure the people with the weapons are actually a force for good? Well, today, we're going to unpack the international rulebook that was designed to do exactly that.
And that's the critical question, isn't it? In a conflict zone, a private security team's decision can literally be the difference between life and death. We're not just talking about protecting buildings or assets here. This is about preventing real harm to real people. And that's why accountability is it's completely non-negotiable.
So often, these security teams are operating in a kind of vacuum, right? They're protecting everyone from diplomats to aid workers. But if there isn't a shared set of rules, a global standard, how do you stop abuses? How do you protect human rights? And how do you earn the trust of the local people you're working alongside? It's a huge challenge, and it really demands a global answer.
Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll dive into the high stakes of the job. Then, we'll introduce the global rulebook itself. After that, we'll see how it creates a cycle of improvement, look at how its principles are put into practice, and finally, wrap up with why all of this really matters.
All right, first up, let's really set the scene and understand the intense, high-stakes environment that made a standard like this so necessary in the first place.
Just try to picture it. You're operating where the usual rules have just evaporated. Security teams have to protect their clients, sure, but also their own staff and the local community, all at the same time. They're making split-second decisions about using force, all while being expected to uphold human rights. If you get that wrong, any hope of building trust or being held accountable just goes right out the window.
So with all that chaos, how do you bring any kind of order to it? Well, the answer came in the form of a major international standard, ISO 1878.
And real quick, for anyone who's not familiar, ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. You can basically think of them as the world's experts on best practices. They create the blueprints for how to do things right, with quality and safety in all sorts of industries, from tech to, you guessed it, private security.
Now, ISO 18788 is not just some simple checklist you tick off. No, it's a whole management system. It's a framework that lets a security company prove verifiably three incredibly important things: that they're professional, that they are absolutely accountable to the law, and that they have a deep foundational respect for human rights.
And look, this standard didn't just appear out of thin air. It was built on the foundation of other critical international agreements, like the Montreux Document and the International Code of Conduct. What ISO 1878 really does is it takes those important principles and turns them into concrete, verifiable actions. It's the how-to guide.
So that's the what. But what actually makes this standard work in the real world? The key is that it's not a one-and-done exam. It's a living, breathing cycle of constant improvement.
And this right here is the engine that drives the whole standard. It's called the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. The entire model is designed to keep security organizations on their toes, to force them to constantly learn, adapt to new threats, and get better at what they do. It prevents complacency.
Here's how it breaks down. First, you plan. You assess all the potential risks and set clear objectives. Then, you do. You put your plans and procedures into action. Next, you check. You monitor how things are going and evaluate if you're actually complying with the plan. And finally, you act. You take what you learned, make corrections, and drive real improvement. It's a continuous loop that just keeps pushing for progress.
Okay, so we've seen the framework. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. What does this management system actually require organizations to do when the boots are on the ground?
It all comes back to this one phrase, really: accountability to law and respect for human rights. This isn't just a nice-to-have suggestion. It is the non-negotiable bedrock of the entire standard. Every single decision, every policy, every action has to align with this core principle.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, it means doing a human rights risk analysis before a mission even starts. For instance, a company might analyze if their presence could stir up local land disputes, and then they'd have to create a plan to mitigate that risk. It means having crystal clear, strict rules on the use of force. It means every single person is vetted and trained properly. And crucially, it means having solid systems for reporting incidents, for handling complaints, and for protecting whistleblowers who speak up. Let's just zoom in on one of those for a second: the use of force. The standard demands something called a use of force continuum. This is a framework that says personnel must always use the minimum amount of force necessary to deal with a threat. It gives clear guidelines for when to escalate if a threat gets worse, but just as important, for how to de-escalate when it subsides.
This is all about control and good judgment, not just brute force.
Okay, so we've gone through the problem, the solution, and the nuts and bolts of how it works. But let's zoom out for the big picture here. Why is a standard like this so incredibly important?
Well, when you look at it, everybody benefits. For clients, it gives them confidence that they're hiring a professional, lawful, and ethical partner. For the security organizations themselves, they get a clear playbook for managing risk and showing off their quality. And, maybe most importantly, for the local communities, it provides an assurance that their human rights will be protected and that there's a system for accountability.
And that's really the bottom line. ISO 18788 is so much more than just a certificate you hang on the wall. It's a practical tool for actually building trust between all these different groups. It's a mechanism for raising the bar for the entire private security industry and for making things safer and more accountable for everyone involved.
And that leaves us with this final thought. While no single document can ever solve every problem, a comprehensive, globally recognized framework like ISO 18788, well, it's a massive step in the right direction. It's a blueprint for responsibility in a field where, let's be honest, the stakes couldn't possibly be any higher.